When an elderly woman entered an upscale restaurant, no one anticipated that her quiet presence would unveil a startling truth and bring the entire room to a halt. The late afternoon sun streamed through the expansive glass windows of Pemberton's Bistro, a prestigious fine dining establishment in Portland, Oregon. The air was filled with soft conversations, the clinking of glasses, and the delicate notes of a pianist playing in the corner. It was the kind of place where guests gathered to mark life's milestones or finalize high-stakes business deals. Amid the polished decor and well-dressed clientele, the entrance door swung open, revealing an elderly black woman. Her movements were unhurried, yet deliberate, her posture upright despite the years that had shaped her. She wore a navy blue coat with intricate embroidery on the cuffs, and a small black handbag was securely tucked under her arm. Her expression was serene, but there was an understated authority in her presence that caught a few glances. The hostess greeted her with a smile that seemed slightly strained, subtle but noticeable. "Do you have a reservation, ma'am?" she asked, casting a brief glance over her shoulder, as if ensuring she wasn't causing a delay. "Yes, under the name Mrs. Holloway," the woman responded, her voice calm and courteous. After scanning the reservation list, the hostess nodded and led her to a table near the kitchen, far from the best spot in the restaurant. Mrs. Holloway said nothing, merely taking her seat, folding her hands on the table, and glancing at the menu. But something felt amiss. Minutes passed, then more. The waiter assigned to her section, a tall man in his late 20s named Todd, walked past her table multiple times, barely acknowledging her presence. When he finally approached, his smile was tight, and his tone carried an unmistakable edge. "Sorry for the wait," he said brusquely. "We're really busy right now. I'll be back shortly to take your order." Mrs. Holloway responded with a gracious nod and a polite thank you. Yet, she couldn't help but notice that the younger, more casually dressed diners around her were receiving prompt and attentive service. She caught the side glances. A woman at a nearby table whispered something to her companion, both of them casting furtive looks in her direction. Another guest furrowed their brow, as if trying to figure out why she didn't quite fit in. Time dragged on. Eventually, Todd returned, but his attitude remained unchanged. "Apologies. We're a bit short-staffed today. It might take some time before I can get to you." Mrs. Holloway's lips curved into a faint smile. "Take your time," she said, her voice betraying none of the frustration she may have felt. She had no intention of making a scene, but the tension in the air was undeniable. As she settled back in her chair, appearing unfazed, someone across the room took note of the entire situation, their expression darkening. From her seat in the corner, Mrs. Holloway quietly observed the room, unshaken. This wasn't her first experience with such treatment, the kind that wasn't loud or obvious, yet made itself known in every delay, every sidelong glance, every unspoken exclusion. Despite everything, Mrs. Holloway remained composed, her hands resting lightly on the table, as though she were simply passing the time. Meanwhile, Todd continued attending to nearby tables, his demeanor bright and effortless, as he joked with customers and took orders. Each time he walked past her without acknowledgement, the unease among the other diners grew. At a table near the center of the room, a young couple exchanged uncertain glances. "Why hasn't that table been served yet?" the woman murmured, her voice barely audible over the soft music. Her partner merely shrugged, stealing a glance at Todd, who appeared completely indifferent. Seconds stretched into minutes. While Mrs. Holloway maintained her calm exterior, a small part of her wondered just how far this would go. She reached for her water glass, only to find it still empty. A few tables away, a waiter delivered a fresh glass of wine to a guest who had arrived long after she had. Todd finally returned, carrying a tray of food meant for another table. As he passed her, he paused just briefly. "Still haven't decided?" he asked, his tone edged with impatience, as if the delay were her fault. Mrs. Holloway looked up, her gaze steady and kind, yet carrying a quiet intensity that made him hesitate. "I'm ready to order whenever you have a moment," she said, her voice measured and polite. Todd gave a curt nod, muttering something under his breath as he walked away. But someone else had been watching. Near the bar, a man in his late 30s sat with a half-empty glass of sparkling water. Dressed in a crisp navy blazer, his expression remained composed, yet sharp, his gaze narrowing as he silently observed every interaction, every dismissive glance. His fingers tapped lightly against the table, his expression growing colder with each passing moment. He wasn't just another diner. He was the owner of the restaurant. And Mrs. Holloway wasn't just any customer. She was his mother. Yet, he wasn't ready to intervene. Not yet. He needed to see how far this would go, how Todd would treat someone he believed to be powerless. As Todd laughed with another table, unaware of the tension thickening in the air, Elijah Holloway leaned back in his chair. Years in the restaurant industry had taught him that patience was a powerful tool, but this was different. Watching his mother endure such subtle yet deliberate mistreatment filled him with a slow, simmering anger. Pemberton's Bistro wasn't just a business to him. It was a reflection of the values his mother had instilled in him: respect, integrity, fairness. She had been his guiding force through years of struggle, the voice reminding him to keep pushing forward. Now, seeing her treated as if she didn't belong in the very space he had built, it felt personal. Elijah noticed every slight: the way Todd avoided her table, the effortless smiles he gave others, while his expression hardened whenever he looked at her. Then, he caught it. The faint smirk Todd exchanged with another server, as if sharing an unspoken joke. Elijah's grip tightened around his glass. This restaurant was his domain, his pride. Every detail bore his mark. Yet, in this moment, he felt powerless. His mother was the one person in the world he would never allow to be disrespected. And yet, here she was, enduring it with a grace he wasn't sure he could muster himself. His mind raced. Should he confront Todd now, making an example of him in front of the entire restaurant? Or should he wait, ensuring there would be no room for excuses later? He chose the latter. Elijah signaled to the manager, Dana, a middle-aged woman who approached cautiously. "Keep an eye on table 12, he murmured. "I want to see how Todd handles this. Don't step in, yet." Dana hesitated but nodded. She knew better than to question Elijah when his tone carried that kind of weight. His attention returned to his mother. She glanced at her watch, her movements deliberate and calm. She wasn't going to complain. Elijah knew that much. Complaints had never been her way. She believed actions spoke louder than words. But Elijah believed in actions too. And soon, Todd would face the consequences of his. The atmosphere in the restaurant had shifted. Conversations had dulled, more patrons stealing glances toward Mrs. Holloway's table. Todd, however, seemed oblivious, or perhaps emboldened, as he passed her again. She politely raised a hand. "Excuse me," she said softly, her voice cutting through the murmurs around her. Todd paused, his expression tightening with impatience. "Yes?" he replied curtly, barely concealing his irritation. "I'd like to place my order now, if you're not too busy," she said, her tone unwaveringly polite. Todd sighed audibly, glancing around as if looking for an escape. "I'll be back in a minute," he muttered, turning away before she could respond. At that moment, Elijah rose from his seat. His movements were deliberate, unhurried. The air in the restaurant seemed to shift as he crossed the room, his presence commanding without a word. He reached Todd, just as the waiter was laughing with another table. The easy arrogance on Todd's face melted into confusion the moment he realized Elijah was standing beside him. "Elijah, hey," Todd stammered, forcing a smile. I didn't know you were here." "I've been here," Elijah said smoothly, his voice calm but firm. "And I've been watching." Todd's smile faltered. "Watching what?" Elijah's eyes flicked toward his mother's table, then back to Todd. "Watching you ignore my mother, who's been sitting there for almost 30 minutes, without so much as a glass of water." The color drained from Todd's face. He glanced toward Mrs. Holloway, who now sat upright, her calm gaze fixed on the unfolding scene. Your mother?" Todd stammered, his voice cracking. "Yes, my mother," Elijah said, his tone sharpening. "The woman you treated like an inconvenience. The woman you assumed didn't deserve the same respect you've been so freely giving every other table in this room." A heavy silence fell over the restaurant. All eyes were on them now. Even the pianist had faltered, his fingers hovering above the keys. Todd parted his lips as if to speak, but Elijah cut him off. "Don't bother," he said, his voice cold. "There's no excuse for what you've done, and everyone here has seen it." He turned toward Dana, the manager, who had been lingering near the bar, uncertain whether to step in. "Dana," he said, his tone even but firm, "take over table 12. Make sure my mother has everything she needs, immediately." Dana gave a quick nod and hurried to Mrs. Holloway's table, her voice full of apologies as she filled the water glass and placed a menu in front of her. Elijah turned back to Todd, his expression unreadable. "We'll discuss your future here later," he said. "For now, you're done. Go home." For a moment, Todd stood frozen, his face a mixture of humiliation and regret. Then, without a word, he untied his apron and walked out, the heavy door swinging shut behind him. A brief silence followed before Elijah made his way to his mother's table. He crouched slightly to meet her gaze, the hardness in his expression softening. "You okay, Mum?" he asked quietly. Mrs. Holloway gave him a warm smile, reaching out to pat his hand. "I'm fine, son. You handled that well." Elijah exhaled, the tension in his shoulders easing. "I should have stepped in sooner." She shook her head gently. "Number you let him reveal who he truly is. Sometimes that's more powerful than calling someone out immediately." As the restaurant returned to its usual rhythm, it was clear the moment had left an impact. Conversations resumed, but the air carried a newfound weight. Those who had witnessed what happened now looked at Mrs. Holloway with a mix of respect and quiet admiration. Elijah returned to his seat, his face composed, though the fire in his eyes had not completely faded. Meanwhile, Dana made sure Mrs. Holloway's meal was served without delay. She personally presented each dish, her apology so sincere it was as if she were trying to erase the entire evening's mistreatment. Mrs. Holloway, as always, accepted it with grace, offering a small nod before turning her attention to her food. She didn't need grand gestures. Her quiet dignity had already spoken volumes. At a nearby table, a young couple who had been watching the incident leaned toward each other. "I can't believe he treated her like that," the woman whispered, shaking her head. "It makes you wonder how often this happens when no one speaks up." Her partner nodded, thoughtful. "It's not just about witnessing it. It's about whether you're willing to stand up when it does. As Elijah passed their table, he caught their words. They stayed with him. He thought about the countless times people like Todd had gotten away with treating others unfairly, simply because no one had been watching, or worse, no one had cared enough to intervene. When Elijah sat beside his mother, she reached across the table and took his hand. "You've built something beautiful here, Elijah," she said softly. "But remember, a place like this isn't just about food or ambiance. It's about how people feel when they walk through those doors." "I know, Mum," Elijah murmured, his voice tinged with regret. "I let you down tonight." She shook her head. "No, you didn't. You gave everyone here a chance to see the truth, and you handled it with integrity. That's what matters." Around them, the staff seemed more attentive, the service more thoughtful. It wasn't just about preventing another incident. It was about the unspoken lesson in Elijah's actions. Respect and kindness weren't optional. They were the foundation of everything. As Mrs. Holloway finished her meal, she took a slow glance around the room. Her eyes briefly met Dana's, who offered her a small, apologetic smile. But Mrs. Holloway held no bitterness, only quiet satisfaction. The moment had left its mark. For Elijah, however, the lesson wasn't just for Todd or the staff. It was a reminder for himself, too. Leadership wasn't only about managing a restaurant. It was about upholding the values that made it a place worth visiting. As the evening wound down, Mrs. Holloway prepared to leave, her calm composure unchanged. Elijah walked her to the door, holding it open as she stepped into the crisp night air. For a moment, they stood together, the warm glow from the restaurant windows casting soft light on their faces. "You did good, son," she said, her voice gentle yet firm. Elijah gave a faint smile. "I just wish it hadn't happened at all." She placed a hand on his arm. "What matters is how you responded. You gave everyone in there something to think about, something they'll carry with them." And that, she knew, was how real change happened. Elijah gave a small nod, watching as his mother walked toward the waiting car. Before stepping inside, she turned back and offered him one last, knowing smile. Inside the restaurant, the staff moved efficiently, closing up for the night, though the weight of what had happened still lingered. Dana gathered the team for a quick meeting, her tone firm but constructive. "Tonight was a reality check," she began. "Not just about how we treat our guests, but about the kind of culture we build here. Every person who walks through these doors deserves respect, no exceptions." The team listened intently, their expressions serious. Todd's absence was noticeable, a stark reminder of what happens when bias overshadows professionalism. As Elijah stepped back inside, his gaze swept across the now emptying dining room. The events of the evening weighed on him, but they also reinforced his vision for Pemberton's Bistro. It couldn't be just another restaurant. It had to be a place where dignity and kindness were as essential as the food itself. For those who had witnessed the night's events, the memory would linger. They had come for an evening of fine dining, but left with something more, a story that underscored the value of respect, the importance of speaking up, and the quiet strength of those who refuse to let injustice go unchallenged. And now, to you, the one hearing this story, ask yourself, what would you have done in that moment? Would you have spoken up? Or would you have stayed silent, letting it unfold? These moments aren't always obvious, but they happen every day. Let this story be a reminder to choose dignity, to choose empathy every time. If this message resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe and share, because it's through these conversations that we all grow together.